We'll get things going here this evening. My name is Deacon Eric Gurash, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. And for those who are watching through live stream, we're very happy to have you with us here remotely participating in this wonderful discussion that we have around such an important topic, this idea of voting and how this civic duty of ours, participating in our democratic society as we have it, how important that is for us as Catholics. And I was just speaking with someone just before we came on here who recognizes that it's so important and yet it's so difficult to navigate as a person of faith in the particular political culture that we find ourselves in. This is an interesting topic also for Dr. Brett and myself. We were looking back, and this topic of voting as a Catholic was our 5th episode for our podcast 4 years ago. 4 years ago in the fall, we were having a very similar conversation in the church, in the culture, and in our podcast for that. And again, very important for us today, especially with how polarized and ever-increasing polarization that we encounter in our society. And so Dr. Brett's going to touch on some of that. I've got a few points to kind of bring to the surface before we get going, and I introduce Brett here for this evening. Tonight's talk is really a condensing of a series of articles that Dr. Brett has been rolling out really throughout this electoral season. And you can find those articles on Catholics and voting at the Archdiocese of Regina website, and that's at www.archregina.sk.ca/news. And if you are following us on Facebook, you will also see those articles be shared fairly regularly over these next few weeks. We will be speaking about, I know Dr. Brett will be mentioning this evening, and you've got the information on your tables here today, Dr. Charlie Camosi, whose latest book, Resisting Throwaway Culture, How a Consistent Life Ethic Can Unite a Fractured People. He has a lot to say on how we as a people of faith are given this prophetic call to navigate this increasingly politically polarized culture. Brett and I, over a couple weeks near the end of September here, had the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Camosi for the Archdiocese of Regina Thinking Faith podcast. The first episode of that 4-part series released today. And again, you can find that through the Archdiocese of Regina website. And the podcast is available on Google Play and iTunes and Spotify as well. And just a series of wonderful conversations around a lot of the issues that are of concern to Catholic voters, and that today, and also that come into play for this Reverence for Life month that we begin here today. In keeping with that, you'll notice on your tables, Campion College is having their inaugural Jesuit lecture series, beginning with Dr. Camosi, who's coming to us from Fordham University in New York to talk about his book and the themes of his book, Resisting the Throwaway Culture. And that's taking place on Wednesday, October 16th, starting at 7 p.m. in the Campion Auditorium as well. I think if the topics that Brett touches on here today pique your interest, you would very much enjoy listening to Dr. Camosi as he opens this up a lot further for us on the 16th. So I'd invite you to consider showing up and coming out for that too. A couple things about how this evening is going to work. In just a minute, I'm going to invite Dr. Brett to begin his talk. He'll have some time to open up this subject on Catholic voting. And you'll notice on your tables, we've got the little cards and some pens for people. As Brett is talking and sharing his ideas and that, I'd encourage you to jot down any questions that kind of pop up into your mind as they come to you through the talk. We'll have a little bit of a break after he is done, and we'll collect these up and kind of collate them into like-minded themes and ideas, and then we'll do a bit of Q&A. I'll throw a few of your your hardballs at him through the last part of our evening here today. Okay? Thank you so much. It has been a great pleasure of mine to get to know Dr. Brett over these last 4 years, first as my formator for diaconate formation, and then also as a co-worker and friend and co-host of the Archdiocese of Regina's podcast, Thinking Faith. Dr. Brett is our official Archdiocesan Theologian, and I am very happy to welcome him here this evening. Thank you, Dr. Brett.
Good evening. He doesn't call me Dr. Brett all day at work. And if you're ill, there are other doctors here who can actually help you. This is a hard talk to give. This is one of the hardest talks I've ever had to prepare. I've been writing on online, the Archdiocesan website, and things going on Facebook, and I'm getting strongly worded letters sometimes. And there will be people in this room who disagree very strongly with me and with each other. And I'm aware walking in that my job tonight isn't to make everyone happy and to tell you exactly what you want to hear. The church's voice in this context is a countercultural voice, and that means that it's going to make us uncomfortable sometimes, and I have to be willing to do that, even if I'm a little shy. But if I say it at the front end, then I'm a little more brave, right? So I'm not going to spend time in the body of the talk analyzing our particular parties, leaders, policies, the race going on in your riding. I'm not going to do that in the main body of the talk. But we can deal with some of that in Q&A because hopefully by then we'll have some common language and some concepts that we might be able to apply well to those kinds of conversations. Part of what my goal is to equip us as Catholics to be able to have these kinds of conversations well, because I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, we live in a culture that is less and less able to have these conversations well. And when they turn into shouting matches and sort of mutual excommunications and all the kind of stuff, we actually lose our prophetic voice in the public sphere, and we get co-opted by the political atmosphere. And so a huge goal for me is to give us tools to be able to have these kinds of conversations well, so that we aren't simply stuck picking for the lesser of 2 or 3 or 4 evils, but that we can actually engage constructively to make those evils less evil. And so that's a big part of my goal. So I'm taking a bit of the long view, right? Not just how are we going to vote in a couple weeks from now, which could improve some things and some other things not so much and whatever. But to build a culture of Catholics who can participate in public life in a way that can make a longer-term difference. That's part of my goal here. So if it feels like I'm not answering who should I vote for, let's be honest, we're going to cancel each other's votes out if we're not actually paying attention to being formed in the mind of the church and taking a different approach in. Catholics don't tend to vote all that much different than everybody else, right? So my goal is a bigger picture than telling you who to vote for 3 weeks from now. All right. On your table, there's a handout. There's only 1 or 2 of them per table. I didn't think this many people were going to show up, actually. That gives you a rough outline. I've got 5 topics I want to walk through, so you can share that out amongst one another. The first one says, yes, vote like a Catholic. My title for tonight's talk, I thought, was maybe a little bit provocative. Some people might think it means which party will a Catholic vote for a few days from now or a few weeks from now. Some people would think that's good and that's what I should do, And people will think that's very bad, and I should never do anything like that. I want to say not which party to vote for. I don't want to say who to vote for, but I want to talk about how to vote. What is the process that Catholics think about and engage in as we approach this? And that process should be thoroughly informed by our Catholic faith. So some people get nervous, like, well, isn't that some violation of the separation of church and state? Aren't you imposing your values on other people? This is a pluralist society. You shouldn't vote like a Catholic. You should keep your religion sort of private, and that's your own business. But when you enter public life with other people who don't share your religious convictions, you gotta put that aside. And I want to say at the front end, yes, vote like a Catholic. You're gonna vote like something. You don't actually get a choice to vote like nothing. You don't get to be neutral. There is no neutral space. All your neighbors are going to vote like something too. People who say they belong to this or that religious group might vote with that as their primary objective, but lots of people say they belong to a religious group and have another worldview that totally overrules their religious point of view, and they vote according to that. But they don't vote in a neutral position. They vote from some set of convictions about how the world works and what is the good of the human person and how do we live together well. People have convictions about that, and they vote from those convictions. And as Catholics, we have convictions about those things, and we should not apologize for voting from those convictions. You'll hear language, don't impose your values or your views on somebody else. What's democracy? It's where we try to impose our views on each other without killing each other, right? It's actually a pretty civilized way of imposing your views on other people. And if you're not willing to impose your views in the ballot box, guess what? Someone's going to impose their views on you. Somebody's views are going to get imposed on us at the end of this process. And we don't need to be shy. We're citizens. We pay taxes. We live here. We can take our whole selves, formed by our Catholic worldview, into that ballot box and make that decision as Catholics. I'm not saying it's easy to do that, but I'm saying let's not pretend that we need to bracket that part of ourselves. There's no neutral space from which to vote, so let's vote as Catholics. By the way, we believe the world needs the gospel, right? Other people with other points of view think the world needs all kinds of things, and those are going to be part of shaping how they vote. We don't need to be shy about saying we think this is what is good for Canada. We think this is what is good for human persons, what is good for our life and community together. The church is clear that this particular work is the work of the laity. This is part of your vocation as a baptized Catholic who is not clergy, which is the vast majority of people in this room. It is the vocation of the laity to bring the gospel to bear on questions of public life, right? So clergy generally don't run for office. They are strongly discouraged from doing it, but lay people are strongly encouraged to run for office and to be participants in the political process. So this is a particular call of the laity according to a Catholic understanding of engaging with the world. Okay, so that's number one. Yes, vote like a Catholic. Which you might think would be really easy if the church would tell you who to vote for. And they won't. The church won't tell you who to vote for. Now, why won't the church tell us who to vote for? In my experience, the most common reason in people's minds that the church won't tell us who to vote for is if the church tells us who to vote for, they'll lose their charitable status. and they'll get in a lot of trouble with the government, right? And then we'll end up paying a lot more taxes, and right, and we don't want to cross the powers that be. And so we have to keep a certain healthy distance to at least not be seen to be endorsing anybody too explicitly, or we might get in trouble, right? Even if there were no restrictions at all from the point of view of taxation and charitable status and everything else, the church should not be telling us who to vote for. There are other really important considerations from the point of view of the church's mission. Consider a couple things. What happens when the church endorses a party and that party ends up being full of sinful humans who screw things up? Politicians who make promises and don't keep them. Politicians who make deals with the church to support the church on this or that issue, if the church will just be a little quiet about this other issue. You don't have to study a lot of history to know that the church has made this mistake occasionally, and whenever the church does it, we pay for it in spades. The church's credibility is shot whenever we get in bed too closely with any given political movement. We limit our ability to engage in a healthy way because now we've got a friend who expects things. And there's a little quid pro quo, and the church loses its freedom to engage in the public sphere, and it also loses its credibility first with the non-Catholics. I mean, that looks terrible. But actually pretty shortly thereafter with any Catholic who has any prudential disagreement at all. The church's insistence that you vote this way or that way when this party starts to look a little smelly means that the next time the church has something to say about something important, people say, well, yeah, but they told us to vote for so-and-so. The church cannot put its eggs in that basket. So credibility is a big question for the church. Another question the church has to consider here is the question of its own moral authority. Moral authority is not something that you have automatically and can use whenever you want. When you use your moral authority to encourage people to do something, there's a certain cost to that. You're sticking your neck out there, and if the church wants to stick its neck out and say, do this, and there's a lot of people, good faithful Catholics, who would have reasonable questions about that, the church's moral authority takes a big hit. If people ask a bishop to tell his people that they should do this or do that, a bishop knows that a huge number of them just won't, even if he says so. Even if he says so with the full authority of his office, lots of people do. We have a hard time getting things in bulletins. Right? We have a hard time getting letters read at parish. It's hard to get all kinds of little things done. To take a stand and say, you must do this, you're going to get a lot of no thank yous, and then you've used that moral authority up, and you have less of it when you need it. So there's a lot, there's good reason for caution around that, which doesn't mean you shouldn't say anything, but it means what you say has to be a way of encouraging people to engage responsibly and not as a directive to tell them exactly what to do, right? Do you see the difference? Another reason why the church won't tell you who to vote for. The church needs to maintain a critical distance from politics so that it can prophetically critique any party or any policy. And so when the church will do this. Now, some of us will disagree with how often and when it does it. But let's take an example from the last, the government that's currently in power, their last term, the Canada Summer Jobs Act. Right? When that came down, the church was free to be able to critique that from a nonpartisan point of view. the bishops and dioceses, and we partnered with all kinds of other, not only Catholics, we partnered with other Christians and people of other religions, and we were able to make a statement that had credibility, and it moved the needle. We didn't get a perfect solution on this one, but we did get better than what we started with. And it was in part because the church had the critical distance to be able to engage as a nonpartisan actor when a particular policy came down. So when I say the church can't tell you who to vote for, that does not mean the church can't speak about policies or issues. The church can and must speak about policies and issues, but it must give itself space to do that with credibility, right? And you lose that credibility when you are seen as with this party or that party, right? A last reason the church won't tell you who to vote for. One of the dangers in our society, you've probably all experienced this and you've seen it, is a growing anxiety about this world's problems. We see crisis after crisis after crisis in the news. We have a political crisis. We have an environmental crisis. We have a crisis in higher education. You pick one. We have crises everywhere, right? And we tend to think that we need to fix them now with the mechanisms of this world. Some people who are concerned about Greta and her climate strike have pointed out something that I think is really interesting, is the level of anxiety that she's operating under and the level of anxiety that is being foisted upon, might be a little strong, but you get the point, on our young people about this issue. Am I saying the issue is not important? No. But I'm saying if we cripple young people with anxiety that their world is going to end in 12 years and that there is nothing except extreme radical action to be done about that, we're sowing all kinds of seeds of anxiety and destruction and vicious public engagement between people who disagree. Because if you disagree with me, you are responsible for the end of the world. That's the stakes. Anyone who disagrees with me on this political question, this economic, we frame the topic so that disagreement is tantamount to like apocalypse. This is the language in our public discourse. And it happens in a lot of issues. And one of the things that the church says by not wading in and saying, look, this is the most important election in your lifetime. By the way, you see that every single election, right? Every single election is the most important in your lifetime. Someone's going to say it about every election. And therefore, we're going to throw caution to the wind and all the reasons that we don't endorse parties and candidates because this one is the most important ever. We're betting on this horse this time. Then the church has just said to the rest of the world, yep, panic. This is it. You don't win now, it's game over. This parish is named for the Feast of Christ the King, which was instituted in the early part of the last century. And it was instituted at a time when various totalitarian political movements were gaining ground, particularly in Europe, but not only in Europe. And it was proclaimed by the church precisely to say that politics is not the be-all and end-all. This is not where we find our salvation. That there is actually something that's, God is in charge whether or not we win or lose this election, whether or not this political party or this political system ends up carrying the day today. And one of the things that does for us, we worry, right? If the church is a little too standoffish about politics, we say, well, then it's saying it's not important and they're letting anything bad happen and some terrible person will get elected. The psychology actually works a little bit differently. if you are totally crippled by the anxiety that you must win, you're actually less effective. But if you say, God has got this, God is the Savior of the world, I'm just a foot soldier, I'm going to do my best, and if we win, we win, and if we lose, we fight again tomorrow, because God has already saved the world and I don't have to. First of all, it just makes us less anxious about the world. But second of all, it actually gives us the spiritual resources we need to engage in politics in a healthy way that is not crippling and anxiety-producing and apocalyptic, right? So that's a final reason why the church needs to maintain a little bit of critical distance, is to say, as important as politics is, the sun is going to rise again the day after the election. And Jesus is the Savior of the world, not your favorite candidate or party or policy, right? All right. My third point, and this is I hope I get this right, but if I don't get it perfectly, I hope I get a couple cracks during Q&A, because this one I want to say well. Don't get co-opted by the system. Have you noticed, have you been in conversations where a group of, where you can't tell who the Catholics are, but you can definitely tell who voted liberal and who voted conservative? What's going on there? That Catholics who vote conservative sound more like non-Catholics or even non-Christians who vote conservative, and Catholics who vote liberal or NDP or Green sound more like non-Catholics or even non-Christians who vote liberal or NDP or Green than we sound like each other. How does that happen? When we've taken on the talking points of the party and lost the sense of where the gospel needs to be informing the party, then you know, all of the metaphors about leaven and salt and whatever, we've missed them. If we are simply repeating the party lines to each other, if we put more effort into convincing our fellow Catholics that they need to make the same political compromises that we made, than we put into convincing our parties that the gospel has something to tell them about their policies and their platforms, the powers of this world are laughing. You've just taken this huge church, which has a very challenging message for the world, and you've taken the most committed and energized people in that church, and you've taken the weapon right out of their hands. Now, instead of them being a force for the gospel in the public sphere, you turn them against each other and you let them go to town. And how many of them convert each other to this or that political party? Not very many. But we'll keep voting for but the parties get off scot-free. They don't get to get challenged because they've managed to turn all our energies towards each other. So whenever you catch yourself in a debate with other Catholics, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be in debates with other Catholics, but whenever you catch yourself in a debate with other Catholics about how they should vote, ask yourself if that is getting more of your energy than working towards a more comprehensive gospel-centered platform within the party that you're committed to. Because as long as we're putting more energy into fighting each other, our impact is extremely limited. And our credibility and our voice in public disappears. There's some test cases you can watch for to know if you're doing this. If you catch yourself making excuses for where your preferred party doesn't line up with the gospel, if you catch yourself doing that, which does not mean that of course you have to vote for an imperfect option. I'm not saying we don't have to vote for imperfect options. Of course we do. But if you catch yourself making excuses for your party, that's a warning sign right there. If you catch yourself downplaying certain elements of church teaching, if you start playing the game, well, this element of church teaching, it's important in theory, of course, but actually it's not nearly as important as this other one, and so I'm not going to consider it in my voting pattern this year. Well, of course we're all going to vote against something that we believe in from a gospel perspective in a few weeks. We're all going to do it. The question is, what have we told ourselves about that compromise? Have we told ourselves it's not really important in order to salve our consciences? Or have we said, it's a tragedy that this is what I have to do, but I have to do it? And I want to work hard so that 4 years later, I don't have to compromise as much as I have to compromise this year. Your vote can be exactly the same vote, but what have you told yourself? What compromise have you made with yourself to make it? And that will tell you something about your relationship with other Catholics who choose to make different compromises, right? When we are engaging with one another, it's very easy to use language like a Catholic can or not even can. A Catholic must do this, or a Catholic must not do that. Now, there are cases where that's true, but there are many more cases where it would be much more helpful to say, look, brother, sister, Catholic, here's the compromise I'm leaning towards making. I wish I didn't have to make it. I think it's the right compromise this year, given a whole range of things, whether it's issues, whether it's the particular candidates in my riding, whether it's, a whole range of things that we can talk about. And given these factors, this is the compromise I feel like I got to make. And in fact, I think it's the compromise you should make. I think it's the best you got. You're actually in a much better position to have a healthy engagement with that other Catholic than if you say, if you vote for this party, you're not a Catholic. No Catholic can vote for this or that person. It might even be true. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. It might even be true. It's still not that helpful. You're not going to win your brother or sister over by condemning them out of the gate. Say, because they can, here's the thing. I can see that your vote is a compromise a lot better than I can see that my vote is a compromise. And it works in reverse. The other person can see very clearly that I'm not voting completely with the gospel on this one. And so if I don't give any sense that there's some compromise here, then I look like a hypocrite, and they're really uninterested in my opinion. But if I can say, this is a tough one, and I got to go this way this year because there's actually more chance of engaging them and even getting them to agree with you than a pulling rank kind of move. All right. But after we do all that, after we admit that our vote is going to be a compromise, after we don't slander is not the right word, but you know what I mean. Slander our neighbors' decisions, right? After we do all that and we've engaged in healthy discussions, we still have to make a decision. We're still going to make a vote, and it's going to be an imperfect vote. So how do we go about making that choice when the time comes? First thing we should do is we should know what church teaching is on the relevant issues. I mean, we should just be informed as Catholics about what church teaching is. There are all kinds of resources for this. The Archdiocese of Toronto has actually produced a nice little set of documents on, I think it's 7 different issues that are at play in this election, and it quotes church teaching on these questions so that Catholics know. It doesn't do the application for you. It doesn't say this party is stronger on this issue and this party is stronger on that issue. That's work that you have to do. But the first thing is Catholics need to know church teaching, and that's a broader question about Catholic culture, right? We got to do that work long before an election comes up. We need to be doing it in RCIA and in homilies and in lay and deacon formation and in talks at parishes and in podcasts and we got to do that work all the time, right? Then you got to know what the party platforms are on the relevant issues. It is really easy today to, and the parties do this on purpose. They want us to not ask the question about policy. Every party has a brand. And not even party, sometimes we have cases both north and south of the border where there are individuals with a brand. And the question, they learn this from advertising, right? They know how to get votes. The question is not, do you think this policy will have these or those impacts? It's, do you identify with this brand? Does this color, the color of the political parties, does this leader, does this make you feel like you belong to something important? That political parties play the same game that we all played in high school, right? We're trying to get people to feel, and it's the same game that brands that are trying to sell you something, whether it's soap or cars or groceries or whatever, they want you to identify with something without asking too many questions, right? And so I would say the vast majority of Canadians would know very little about the differences in policy between the 3 or 4 major parties on climate change. They wouldn't know a lot about the particular details being suggested that would be the best way forward on this. But they do know which parties have that as part of their brand and which don't. Same thing with a whole range of issues. You identify yourself with a brand and you don't ask questions about policy. And our job is to not play that game. To actually say, what policy will make a difference on this issue that matters to me? And actually compare apples to apples and don't get caught in doing branding, right? Once you've done that, it's going to be crystal clear that there are no perfect choices. And what does the church say we should do when we don't have a perfect choice, which is actually always, but maybe even more so today than usual, right? People seem frustrated with their choices. The church says that if you vote for bad policy, and all of us are going to do it, we're all going to vote for some bad policy or other. If you vote for bad policy, you need a proportionate reason to do that. What does that mean? When in life we are faced with awkward situations where no matter what choice we make, we can foresee some consequence that we don't like and we don't intend, but the other option isn't any better and maybe worse, then we have to start weighing what is the good I am intending with this move, and how does that weigh against the bad that I can foresee even though I don't intend it? Is that, I know that's quite technical, right? So one of the goods in politics is the good of not having a worse option. That's the simplest part of the calculation, right? I'm going to vote for this thing, which is not great, because this other thing is even worse, which is basically the 2016 election in the States, right? I think that's a lot of people did the calculation that way, right? But then actually look at particular issues and policies. If I think that there is a party that can make a positive difference on an issue that matters to me personally, but also to me as an informed Catholic, what is that specific difference? What difference can that party make? Not do they agree with me in theory about this issue. That's just branding. What concrete specific thing can be done on this question? And What other things are they going to do well and move forward on from my Catholic point of view? And how do those compare to things where there's going to be setbacks, where I'm going to say this is less than ideal from my Catholic point of view? I cannot compare simply the ideal for my candidate against the practical reality for the opponent. This is our favorite game, right? We know that if the other guys get elected, they're not going to solve the problem they're promising to solve. But they might move the needle on it a little bit, but they're not going to solve it outright. Can we remember that the candidate we're going to support hopefully will move the needle on the question that's of importance to us, but is very unlikely to solve it outright? By the way, if you have a major moral question of serious importance to Catholics, and you have a political party that's going to solve that one outright, God bless you. Right? If they're going to fix that in their next term, you would need a really, really, really good reason not to vote for them, right? But that's not the world we live in. We don't live in a world where any party is going to fix any problem in the next 4 years. We live in a world where the needle on this issue is going to move a little bit from this party, and on this other issue, it'll move back a little bit, and that's what we're comparing when we're looking for proportionate reasons. What can actually be done? So when a candidate comes to your door and you say, I'm pro-life, I want to vote for a pro-life candidate, and they say, I'm your guy, then you say, tell me about that. What policy is available? What can be moved? Where is there room? What's the low-hanging fruit? Pro-life is an important question, but you do the same move on any other question. Yes, they agree with you on this topic. Where is there room for movement, and how are they going to move it? That's the thing you have to weigh if you're going to judge these questions fairly. The last thing to note on this making a choice, and I'm sure this will come up in Q&A and more practical, so we can leave that. We can leave some of the more practical ones for that. If all of us here follow exactly the same process according to Catholic teaching, and we know church teaching, and we know party platforms, and we judge fairly, not the ideal, but the real and the practical, and we weigh everything out as best we can, there is no guarantee that we all come to the same conclusion. The formula does not guarantee a right answer. And the reason for that is there are a vast number of unknowns. We are guessing might be, well, and sometimes we are just guessing, but in a lot of cases, we're kind of intuiting, like, I think this policy, if it gets implemented, will do the good that we hope it will do. I think there's a reasonable chance that this policy actually passes the House. I think that this policy will hold up in the courts. I think that the people of Canada, when this policy is introduced, will respond to it in this way. But those are a lot of I thinks that you can't nail down. And so there's a lot of prudential judgment, so that even if we all carefully walk through the steps, we might not land on the same page as one another when it's over, right? Now, sometimes the options are starker than others, right? In a given riding or with a given leader or a given issue, there might be really clear-cut things where a lot of us, maybe the vast majority of us, would land on the same page. Maybe. That happens sometimes, and there's nothing to say it can't when there's really clear questions and answers, right? Just to consider, most of us are probably from either Regina Wascana or Regina Louvain, probably most of us in this room. Both of those are basically 2-horse races, right? That simplifies the calculation, right? A 2-horse race is a different thing than a theoretical 4 or 5 horse, right? Because once you get down to brass tacks, there are particular things that make certain kinds of decisions simpler. So it is possible that we would land, a lot of us, on the same page, but the process doesn't guarantee it, because there is a lot of prudential judgment and intuition and even hope and guesswork, right? And that's not anyone's fault. That's just how it is. All right. The last point on the sheet. Your vote is a blunt instrument. If you are disappointed that doing all the calculations right doesn't guarantee the same outcome for all of us, I think I sympathize, because I'm disappointed. I wish these things were clearer, but part of the problem is that our vote is a really blunt instrument. If one issue carries the day for me, and I vote on that issue, the pollsters and everyone else who takes the surveys and phones me and the people who analyze the thing after the fact have no idea how agonized that vote was. They think if I voted for this party, that I more or less supported almost everything that party does. So I can't even communicate to my elected representatives with my vote all my priorities at all. I can communicate one really compromised move. And so if I want my vote to mean more than it does as a sort of blunt instrument that doesn't say a whole lot about what I believe, then I need to engage in politics far beyond voting. A really simple thing is conversations with the candidates who are coming around looking for your vote, right? If someone comes to your door and you're going to vote for them, or you think you're likely to vote for them, it would be a great conversation for a Catholic to say, I'm going to vote for you, but if there was someone better, I'd vote for them, because I'm not happy about X, Y, and Z. Let them know that you want more out of that vote, that they can't settle, that they can't count on your vote, that they can't take you for granted because you agree with them on this or that issue, or because you had to make this or that compromise. Push them for more. If that's the person you're voting for. Someone comes around who you're not voting for, I'd put on the smiley face. I like this policy. I think you guys have a great idea with this policy. I'd love to be able to vote for you for that policy if you weren't so bad on this other policy. Let them know that you're interested, that they can actually do something for your vote. If you can let them know, one of the great tragedies right now that we really have to work on is allowing for the possibility of pro-life candidates in other major parties. We need to tell those parties that is a huge deal to us, that they would allow pro-life candidates in their parties. So if someone comes and you say, I can't vote for you on this, but I could if you could throw me a bone here. This really matters to a lot of people. And we all feel completely ignored. Raise those issues with your candidates, right? I think it would be really remarkable if Catholics on Facebook on election day, if you have more nerve than I do, said, I voted for so-and-so today, and I wish I didn't have to because, but I did have to, because this is the compromise I felt I had to make. Let them know that there is room for improvement, because if we don't let them know there's room for improvement, we'll get the same options in 4 years. We have to find ways to let them know. That's the first step. Some of us will have more time and energy for these other steps. Become a member of a political party. Find the one that's closest to you, and then work from the inside where they're not. I mean, the votes we get to cast in a few weeks are on a set number of options that most of us didn't have a lot of input on saying what those options were going to be. If you don't do the front end work of trying to influence party policy, and now some people, God bless you, if you're already doing that work, amen. I don't mean to slam all of us. I mean, we need Catholics doing that work, right? If you're not happy with party policy, what can you do to shift it in a gospel direction? Another thing that's really, really important that Catholics should be the ones doing well is to work across party lines on key issues. Take abortion as the prime example. Is there any hope of changing Canadian law on abortion as long as only one party even allows people to talk about it? As long as, if your goal is for that party to get in and change the law, then as soon as they lose, it's gone. If we don't work across party lines on those kinds of topics, we're in an echo chamber. We're not getting anywhere. And so there's a group, I don't know if you know this group, they're called Right Now. They released a graphic. This is a wonderful graphic that Catholics need to know this. It gave percentages of people who voted for each party in the last election that would prefer to see some kind of legislation on the question of abortion. It was well over 50% for every single party. It was over, I think it was like 66% of conservatives, 56 or 7 for NDP and Liberal, and something over 50 for the Greens. A majority of people who voted for every single major federal party would like to see some legislation on this question. That's an opportunity. And if we're not interested in working across party lines on that, it's like we're giving up, right? So working across party lines is, I think, a huge commission for Catholics. Raising awareness on issues, right? Being involved whenever there's a major policy question that's happening, either because the government has passed a law or made a certain decision. We went through this with physician-assisted suicide several years ago, right? That we get our voices out there and we talk about it and we let people know our perspective and we let people know what they don't know, because there's a lot of misinformation or just ignorance out there. Human trafficking is another one. We have massive problems with human trafficking in contemporary culture. And this is a thing that almost all of us can agree on if awareness was raised. But if I went on Facebook to look at the CBC News, when the body rub parlor thing was going on, and all the talk was, well, not all of it, the vast majority of the talk was about, let people do what they want, or this is, it was either this is bad and dirty, or let people do what they want, it's a free country. And almost nobody talking about the people who actually don't want to be employed there. But all across, left, right, center, I don't care who's in favor of human trafficking. Like, these are the kinds of things where we can be working across party lines and raising awareness. So those kinds of things, and that kind of work builds community and networks that actually know how to get things done, right? So strongly recommend those kinds of things. And then the last thing is to work really hard to make sure that your conscience is being formed by the church between now and the next election, because there are a lot of things out there that are trying to form your conscience. And the political parties are delighted if you can frame all the questions in the terms that they frame the questions in. If they want to create a dichotomy between this issue and that issue, between the rights of this group and that group, and you have to pick one or the other, they're delighted, because then they get to stick with the status quo, they get to keep their brand, they get to keep their voters, and they don't have to get challenged. Watch out for what's the media that you're reading, and what narrative is that reinforcing? What are the things that are forming your conscience? Do you find yourself saying, church teaching on this question, not really that important, or kind of silly, or kind of short-sighted, or whatever. All of us have the church teaching that we really agree with, and we can see when other people are casually dismissing it without engaging it in a fulsome Catholic way. Can we recognize when we're doing the same thing on an issue that maybe doesn't line up with our politics as well? If we put in the work of forming our Catholic consciences so that we can reject the false dichotomies that are presented to us in the political sphere, and then try to get those in action with stuff like working behind the scenes on policies, working across party lines on issues. Our impact can be dramatically magnified compared to the impact that 1 or 2 votes is going to have on some options that we wish were better. So I have no idea how long I talked. But I'm done now. Let's get coffee and juice. Get Deacon Eric your questions, and we'll look at them for Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brett. Give him a hand. Very good. I will come around, and if you just wanted to leave your question cards just at the edge of the table, you get up and stretch your legs and grab another beverage. I'll come around and collect those up in just a minute here, okay? And then we'll break for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and throw some of our questions at Brett. Thank you very much. here right away, and we've got a few questions here for Dr. Brett. There are a few questions that have just very quick, like, where do I find this kind of answer? So I'll share a couple of those answers right now. One of them was about the address for the Toronto Archdiocese outline documents that Dr. Brett was talking about.
And we can post them on our diocese
Yes,
Facebook.
we'll post them on our Facebook page, and they are in the most recent voting article that went up today through our news service at the Archdiocese of Regina. But if you go to www.archtoronto.org, so that's www.archtoronto.org/election. They've got a whole host of election information there, and right near the bottom, you'll find a list of what they're calling their backgrounders. And that covers those topics of the environment, human dignity, Indigenous persons, newcomers, political participation, those kinds of things. So that would be one of those, where do I find it kind of questions. And I thought there was one other. I'm going to keep there.
Should I be looking through these while you're
Yeah,
doing
no, I've got those sorted already there. Yeah,
okay.
so that's okay. Yeah, I think that was the only one. There we go. Yeah, you don't get to see them ahead of time. That's cheating. All right. Okay, so we had a couple of kind of clear categories. One to do more generally with the issues around voting as a Catholic in general, and then another cluster of questions really navigating around the life issues and some of those that really are at the forefront of a lot of Catholic voters' minds, and that here. So we'll start with the big ones that in your talk on how to vote as a Catholic didn't get addressed directly. And there's a number of questions around how we get our political candidates to talk more on a regular basis about these core life issues, which it seems is very easy for them to ignore, especially around voting times. And so what are some of the ways that we can address those?
Yeah, I think the trick with being a pro-life candidate is you've been told by your party to keep it on the low down, right? So I have a pro-life candidate in my riding, and I get the stuff in my mailbox, and there's no mention of pro-life on any of the literature. So he comes to my door, and I say, how come there's no pro-life on the literature? If that matters to me. And he says, well, we've been handed enough other issues that we should be able to win this one without wading into controversial territory. It's a calculation. There's a lot of people who are going to vote for us because they agree with us about taxes, and we don't want to stir up that nest, right? I appreciate the temptation. You don't want to bring it up and then lose, and then you can't do anything. I understand the logic. What do they need to be able to do that? They need to know that Canadians care about it, but also that we can't be taken for granted, right? It's really easy to just tell the pro-lifers you're pro-life and get that pro-life vote and then go campaign with everyone else on other issues. Justin Trudeau tells us on a weekly basis, I think, that the abortion debate in Canada is closed. I don't know of another issue that is closed that we have to be reminded of every week. Why do you have to tell people something's closed? It should be obvious if it actually is. So it's actually not closed. Canadians actually do care about this issue, but our political culture has been convinced that it's a losing argument to talk about it in public. And I think we need to empower our candidates to be able to talk about it. And I think some of the things I mentioned, like if you have someone from a party that doesn't allow people in that position come to your door to say, I'd love to vote for you on question X and question Y and question Z, but you won't even throw me a bone here. Like, let's have a conversation. Let's invite people into those. So I think we need to show that the conversation is alive and encourage the pro-life candidates to be able to engage. I think one of the best things we've got going right now, I'm going to say it before I say it. One of the best things we got going right now in Canada is Right Now. Right Now is a group of young people who they were working in pro-life work in what we might call the old guard Canadian pro-life movement, and they were getting frustrated, and they were saying, we are not getting anywhere, and you guys don't understand how this works, and we need a new way of engaging. And they've had some remarkable successes, and they're willing to work across parties. That doesn't mean every party is willing to work with them, but those are two different things, right? Just because someone's not willing to work with you doesn't mean you write that off, because if we don't engage, there are people all across this country who have voted for Liberals and NDP and Green Party candidates who are pro-life people, who would very happily would like to be able to vote pro-life. So we need to let the candidates know that those people exist and to embolden them to be able to talk about that. It's tricky because we live right now in a system that is systematically trying to shut down the conversation. And I think groups like Right Now are better than most at trying to reopen that conversation in a way that can actually be productive. So I would defer to their expertise actually more than my own. Check them out. They've come through town here and had some events. Their director or co-director has been here. Her name's Alyssa. Follow them on Facebook, stuff like that. But yeah, on the one hand, don't let the one party take you for granted, and don't let the other parties write you off. Right? Make sure you're engaged on those questions.
And so, yeah, we had a number of questions kind of revolving around those issues. This one is there was another group of questions that were fairly similar. Are there particular issues that, as Catholics, we should look at as priorities in determining our vote? So is there, and I know I was thinking about this when I was sitting at the back of the room, is there kind of a hierarchy in Catholic social teaching or Catholic moral ethics that we should use to categorize some of these issues?
Yes, but it's tricky to use it well. So the hierarchy is, there is a primacy of life and dignity issues. Because if you don't have that, you don't have anything. I mean, so there's a certain primacy. How do you engage them, though? We can be made into puppets if we say we must vote on this no matter what any of the other options are, no matter if the party who's allowing a candidate to run on this will even do anything. If we say we must only and everywhere vote on this category alone, we actually we allow a group to take us for granted and not ever necessarily do anything about it. And so if we're going to put that at the top of our list, we need to follow it up with the other kinds of things we've been talking about. Because if you take any issue, I mean, for Catholics it could be abortion, but take any group in any issue. If they're a guaranteed vote on this issue, whether you do anything about it or not, you've just defanged them. You've just made them. You've taken away their capacity to have an impact in the public square. So, absolutely, 100%, there is a primacy of life and dignity issues. But what does Jesus say? I mean, about doves and innocence as doves and wise as serpents. Don't let yourselves be turned into free votes that are not ever owed anything by a party. And that's an easy thing to have happen if we say every other issue doesn't matter because we have to vote this way on this one, whether or not anything can be done. And so saying, for example, to a party that says, well, you can have pro-life backbenchers who can bring up legislation, but we won't reopen the debate, etc. Then you say things like, what can you do? If you're not reopening the debate, what are you doing? And I was just talking with Dr. Pavlovsky. Is that how I say your name? A question you can put to those people is the question of foreign funding. The question of foreign funding for health care, right, is actually something where there might be room for movement because it doesn't require getting past the Supreme Court of Canada. It doesn't even require legislation to pass in the House, at least certain kinds of it. So ask those questions. What are the things that can actually be done instead of just treating it as an ideal that doesn't have practical, concrete content? So yes, there is a hierarchy, but don't let it become just an idea that doesn't need practical content, or then we become puppets. By the way, that's my prudential judgment on those kinds of questions, right? Catholics, of course, we can disagree about things of prudential judgment. Not every prudential judgment is the same thing as church teaching, just to be clear that we can disagree about those kinds of things.
Okay. Excellent. And so then we had another set of questions. And again, it's interesting because I found myself looking for a little bit more clarity in that area as well. One way of phrasing it, and that I've heard even outside of this talk is it sinful to vote for a pro-abortion candidate, someone who's explicitly pro-abortion? And you touched a little bit on this when you were talking about making compromises, right? And proportionate reasoning and stuff. But maybe you could expand on that a little bit, how that works for us as voters.
Yeah, on this there is very clear church teaching. It might be. It might be sinful. But the church teaching is, it is not sinful in and of itself. And the church, okay, let's do a thought experiment. Candidate A, pro-abortion. Candidate B, pro-abortion and pro-euthanasia. No candidate C. Is it sinful to vote for a pro-abortion candidate? Church doesn't say that it is, right? It might be, and here's where the church says it is. The church says if you vote for a pro-abortion candidate because they are pro-abortion, that is sinful. That's the teaching of the church. If you vote for a pro-abortion, and by the way, we're talking about abortion, substitute any other evil you want for this. Substitute assisted suicide, substitute all kinds of. If you vote for something that is evil in the eyes of the church because you support that position, that is sinful. If you vote for someone who promotes some evil or other, because in your judgment, to the best of your ability, that was a lesser evil than this other evil, that is not sinful. You might be wrong. You might have made a mistaken calculation. That is not the same as a sin, right? You're judging a prudential thing. This one may or may, these both don't look great to me. As far as I can tell, it's going to be worse if I go this way, so I'm going to go this way, and that's the compromise I made. I might disagree with your compromise, and you may have made a mistaken calculation, but that is not the same thing as a sin. So that is actually, that is very clear. Whether I've said it clearly, you can judge. But the church is actually very clear on that question. It is not sinful to vote for a pro-abortion candidate as a compromise with and the technical term that the church uses is for proportionate reasons, right? So you need a very strong reason. It has to be proportional to the evil that you can foresee. So it has to be very strong reason. But it's not sinful in itself. All
right, and so another cluster of questions around voting in general for us as Catholics, in essence, one could come away from a talk like this wondering, does it really matter if I vote at all in this kind of situation? And so, what are our options as Catholics in the process of voting? Does the church say we must vote? Is it possible that we decide, well, this time around, I think I can't give anyone my vote? What about spoiling our ballots? Those kinds of options.
So yeah, I can certainly speak to church teaching on this, and then we can think about some practical considerations. From the point of view of church teaching, not voting could be sinful depending on why. Right? If you don't vote because you're lazy or cynical, that could be a sin. Not voting as a sort of protest move. Let's say you think you live in a place where the democracy's not real and everything's rigged, and you want to make I'm not saying that's the right move or the wrong move. I'm just saying that is within church teaching, there would be possible justifications for an act like not voting. Very similar logic would apply to spoiling your ballot, right? If you want to, a very common way to spoil your ballot is to write in a candidate, right? So if you are so disgusted with your options and you want to be able to say somehow what option you think would be better, and you want to write, Mother Teresa on your ballot or whatever you want to write, spoiling it somehow, that is not outside the realm of church teaching, right? But it is not a way of avoiding cooperating with evil, right? So think about this. The church says when you vote for an imperfect candidate, you are cooperating with evil, but voting for the other candidate would have also been cooperating with evil. But spoiling your ballot or not voting is also cooperating with evil. We're all going to cooperate with evil here in a few weeks, folks. No matter which way you go, you're going to do it, right? So the church doesn't say you can't ever do any of those things because it's actually unavoidable. We're going to be cooperating with evil one way or the other. That's church teaching. Now let's think about our specific context. I think you'd have to make a really good argument in our specific context to spoil your vote or stay home. I don't think we're in a place where, we think the election is rigged or whatever else. I mean, it's hard to imagine what the argument would be that would do that. But here's an intermediate thing that's not staying home or spoiling your ballot. But here's something that a lot of us might actually do. Vote for someone that you know is not going to win. Right? We have more than 2 parties on the ballot. And in most of our ridings, it's going to be a 2-horse race. And if you vote for the third place party, which most of us know what the third place party in our riding is going to be, actually, then you are giving the favorite an advantage over the second place candidate. Does that make sense? So voting for a third party is something, of course you can. I mean, no one ever thought to think, does the church say you can't vote for a third party or a fourth or a fifth party? But it requires a certain kind of calculation, right? You're saying, I'm more or less taking myself out of this one. I'm going to let these two go head to head and let the rest of my neighbors determine which of them wins. And I'm voting for a third on principle. Maybe I really love their platform. They're the ones that I can vote with my conscience. And I guarantee by that act to not impact the difference between first and second, which I might see a moral difference between. That's a tricky move, right? I am comfortable saying, because it's on our podcast, so it's a matter of public record, that if I was an American in 2016, I would have voted for a third party. One of the reasons you might vote for a third party is the total number of votes that is generated by a third party tells the parties that are actually in the running that there are votes to be had that they are leaving on the table. So if I voted for the American Solidarity Party instead of the Republicans or the Democrats, and 2 million other Americans voted for the American Solidarity Party, then the Republicans or the Democrats, the margin of victory was something close to that number, they'd say those are a bunch of votes hanging out there from people who really dislike both of us. What do they want? If you're an American looking at a Canadian political system, you could make a reasonable argument that the New Democratic Party, which has never held federal power in Canada, has a platform that looks a lot like the Canadian system from an American point of view, right? Think about healthcare, right? When Americans look at Canadian healthcare and the history and whatever that part, they never held federal power, but they managed to influence public policy from a third-party position. You can make that calculation. It's not an easy calculation, but it's a calculation you can make, right? If you let's say there were two, to go to the abortion example, because that's the most common one in the questions. There were two pro-choice candidates, and there was a pro-life candidate who was guaranteed to lose. But you made the calculation, I'm going to vote for that person, knowing that they're going to lose and that I will thereby let the worst of the other two win unopposed, but I will be saying to the whole political system that my vote is here for the taking if you would just give me something in that direction, right? So spoiling ballot, staying home, possible within Catholic teaching, though really hard to justify, I think, in our particular situation. But something like a third-party vote, much more within the realm of possibility, right?
All right, and I think this will be our last question set for the evening here, as we look at the time. But these ones kind of fall together as well around the best context for doing the kind of political work you talked about at the beginning, how the work of politics is largely the work of the laity. Are political parties the best place for us to do that work? And how can we continue to be a prophetic voice, for example, say for the person sitting in the Prime Minister's seat? If for example, we were to get, and we have in the past in our context, a candidate who makes the outward claim of Catholic faith and doesn't seem to be living up with that, how do we hold our candidates accountable for those kinds of things? Yeah, so kind of a
That's a mishmashy question. Yeah, what's the, okay.
We're trying to get them all.
Yeah, that's 4 questions in one. Let's try. Okay. I think it is good to work within parties, but I think whoever wrote the question makes a good point that we shouldn't limit ourselves to working within parties. I think there's lots of work to be done in communities on specific issues, in local contexts where we don't have a party system. I would not want to be trapped into a completely party-centric imagination. I think it is even though influencing federal party platforms is very important work and we need Catholics doing it, I don't want to say that that's the only kind of work. Even that work depends on other work. I mean, I listened to a talk, a friend of mine gave a similar a talk on a similar topic to this in Vancouver on Saturday night. And his argument was essentially that Catholics need to get together and eat and drink and talk more often. That was his prescription. Now, that might sound too simple, but actually that kind of work is really important, right? To build up the community and to run ideas past each other and to find out what's going on. So yeah, I don't want to be too party-centric, even though that's important. I would also highlight, I've had a couple conversations tonight about our frustration with the way our party system is working. In our federal system, the idea was supposed to be that local candidates could speak for their constituencies in the caucus. And in the last 15 to 20 years, the experience of the local candidate as representative of the constituency has been radically diminished. People are whipped much more severely, even to the point, one of the conversations I had pointed out something I hadn't thought of, but is perfectly true. I remember growing up, in the early to mid 90s, I knew who most of the cabinet ministers were. We know fewer and fewer of who the cabinet is. I only know a cabinet minister if they're in the news right now. The basic federal system that was supposed to allow for local representation is becoming more and more whipped. I would suggest a big part of this has to do with what I called branding in the earlier talk. You need to stay on point. You do not go off script. You stick with the brand. The brand is what carries the day. All of us will have seen this happen. I wish I could say to the party leaders, if you don't answer a question directly in a debate, I won't vote for you. But then I'd just not be voting, wouldn't I? Because their handlers have taught them, you do not answer a question directly in a debate. We've all seen, it's embarrassing to watch them not answer questions. So there are fundamental problems in our democracy in terms of federal representation, the role of cabinet ministers, our ability to engage in actual discussions and answer questions directly. No, people are told to stay on point. We are managed by media specialists. And so I think a lot of the work that we have to do is actually modeling conversations, actually engaging with people, looking at the problem, bouncing ideas off one another, considering things from other points of view, trying to work through, because most political problems, not all of them, most of them are complicated. Right? Most things, economy, environment, these are really complex kinds of problems. If we don't know how to have conversations about them, we're going to get sound bites and slogans and policy that didn't have to be well thought through because it was never part of an actual engaged dialogue, but it was really about branding. And I think that's poison for democracy. So I think we need to, that kind of work I think is really important. There was another question in there that was quite unrelated to the others as far as I could tell, about Catholic public figures who are not acting Catholic. Yeah. It's I don't know. This is so disheartening. I mean, it's just hard to watch. I don't know what a solution is except to say, remember my opening comments were, there isn't a neutral. You're actually going to be governing or voting or whatever according to some worldview. If your position is, I'm a Catholic, but I'm not going to take my Catholic values with me when I vote, because I'm going to do a neutral thing, well, then you've just said that those other values are actually your values. That's what they are. Those are your values. And so let's just be honest that that's what we're doing, is all of us actually are promoting some policy or whatever that we think is good. If I say I'm personally opposed to this as a Catholic, but as a Canadian I have to let it happen, well then I'm saying then I'm not really all that personally opposed anyways, actually. So to call out the double bookkeeping of this, like, oh, I believe this thing privately, but it doesn't impact. No, like, what you really think is coming out. Don't tell me you really believe something else, but you can't act according to it. We don't actually expect that of anybody else, right? We don't ask people with other worldviews to park it and not participate as citizens because they happen to be, take your pick, ethnicity, religion, sex, whatever, right? No, we all come in with that stuff. So it's so disheartening that narrative has taken over so that it becomes a legitimate public move to be able to say, well, privately I personally believe this, but it actually won't have an impact. I think we all know that when we get politicians in that box, we're slowly destroying their own integrity, right? Like, this is one of the reasons why public life is so hard, because you get asked to compromise your own integrity all the time. And Catholics should not be the ones asking people to compromise their integrity. We should be asking people to maintain their integrity and to stand up when that kind of narrative is being floated. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's a bit of a rant.
Yeah, I think that's essentially our call to each other. And actually, what I was thinking about while you were rambling on and on and on was really, in all seriousness, that call to Catholics engaging in conversation with each other. Catholics rediscovering our call to reject kind of the radical individualization that is within the culture around us, and model how we come together and walk together with each other. Because it's a lot easier for you to hold me accountable because we walk together than to do that with strangers and that together. And so that's kind of where I was at with that. Thank you so much. Yeah. One of my big takeaways from here today, and it hit me the second time you said it this evening, was the fact that in just a few weeks, we're all going to go to the polls. Well, hopefully we all go to the polls. And we're going to compromise ourselves. We're going to make compromises in our faith. And that sat really heavy in my heart when I heard it both times. And I think for a Catholic, that may just be a good space to take with us into the polls, that heaviness. This is a serious compromise I'm being asked to make here. So thank you for that. Good.
You're welcome.
And thank you for this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. And for those on the live stream and who may watch it at later dates, God bless you.
I made Eric sad.